During World War II, the United States military needed an unbreakable code to communicate classified information. To make this code, the military sought out the Navajo Nation. By allying with the Navajo and using the unique language as a military code, history was made for Native Americans. The Navajo Code Talkers began one of the largest reforms of indigenous representation in the United States.
This is the Navajo Code Talkers, a symbol of pride by Avery Brenner
and Emma Gavrilut. Native involvement in the military goes farther back than just World War II. In fact, it started at the beginning of American colonization. During the Revolutionary War, several Oneida warriors fought alongside the colonists for Fort Stanwix in Oriskany in 1777, one of the first to take sides against the British. They additionally brought bushels of valuable food aid to starving soldiers at Valley Forge. These Oneida people were one of the first documented to help the United States in combat, which began a long chain of Native roles in the military.
Before the Navajo and other Native groups helped the United States with making it code, indigenous people were severely mistreated. Since the Europeans came to the Americas, they had faced constant racism and discrimination. Congress passed the Civilization Fund Act in 1819. Before that, the sentiment around civilizing the Native Americans rose rapidly, which ultimately led to this legislation. This act not only suggested, but encouraged schools to push an Americanized education on indigenous people. This led to boarding schools for Native Americans that ultimately penalized and erased large parts of their culture, often violently. In particular, the use of mother languages was forbidden and seen as inferior and punished harshly.
The first of these institutions was called Carlisle Indian Industrial School, created by Richard Pratt. In these schools, children were forced to use English instead of their native languages. Most children in their indigenous communities were forced to attend schools such as these, as that was the only type of school Native kids could attend. The Christian faith was taught there, and Native children had to change their names to sound less like their cultures. This suppression of Native language and culture continued for decades after the Civilization Fund Act, continuing into the early 1900s. Despite the suppression of Native language, when the First World War hit, a squad of young men used Choctaw to communicate in battle, avoiding interception from enemy Germans. The Choctaw Telephone Squad inspired trust in indigenous soldiers and became the foundation for the Navajo Code Talkers more than 2 decades later. In 1941, Pearl Harbor was infamously bombed, directly facilitating America's declaration of war. Men of a vast age range were recruited for war, focusing on younger men. Specifically, the Marines began to recruit young Navajo or other Native men. At first, 29 men were trained and put together a code made purely of Navajo. Thus began the first of the Code Talkers. In 1942, the Code Talkers were deployed to their first battle, Guadalcanal. This battle was the first time the Code Talkers were able to actually test their code. The code, having been made from an unwritten language, was almost impossible to decipher. Without fail, the Navajo men were able to successfully communicate through the 6-month campaign. They most commonly transmitted warnings of enemy tactics and positions.
The Code Talkers went on to participate in every major battle the Marines were involved in. They sent hundreds of hidden messages every battle, the count going over 800 during Iwo Jima, their highest amount. The soldiers had to balance hiding from the enemy soldiers while also efficiently communicating in ciphers. From the words of Marine Officer Howard Connor, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima.
The code is highly complicated and requires rounds of translation. At its core, the code is made of 26 Navajo words, which each represent a letter of the English alphabet. Then, these words would spell out terms or phrases used in combat. For example, the Navajo word to Altsahogan means hid, which actually translated to camp in military terms. A total of 411 terms were made at the end of development.
By 1945, the war was over. Countries were left in shambles, cities in ruin, families without sons. Despite their hard work and risking their lives, the Code Talkers were told to keep their contributions secret. Out of concern that the military would need the code for the future, everything remained classified. In peacetime, the Code Talker veterans had little job opportunities. Not only that, but the soldiers were left with debilitating trauma that weighed over their civilian lives. Healing for these people often came in cultural rituals called squaw dances. John Brown Jr. touched on this as he said, "I had nightmares thinking about the blood, and they probably got into my mind. And they had a squaw dance for me in Crystal, and I imagined they killed that evil spirit that was in my mind."
Even with the challenges of missing rights and racism towards American Indians, many of them were able to accomplish things just as great as being a veteran. They became artists, teachers, craftsmen, and more. One example of this is John Pinto. Pinto served as a senator for Arizona for 42 years, advocating for public education funding, recognition of discrimination, and legislation supporting the Navajo Nation.
Many code talkers continued pursuing the occupations they loved long after the war. Navajo has, and is presently, taught at several colleges around the Southwest, such as Diné College and the University of New Mexico. Bit by bit, the legacy of the code talkers has undone the effects of cultural erasure for long years.
In 2000, the Recognizing Navajo Code Talkers Act was written into law. The original 29 veterans were awarded Congressional Gold Medals. Later, in 2008, another act was passed to recognize the other tribes involved in World War II.
Since the end of the Second World War, the freedoms and accomplishments of the indigenous have gotten better. Since 1957, Native Americans of all states have secured a right to vote. Culture and languages of natives are preserved by museums, and the Indian Civil Rights Act applied the Bill of Rights to tribes.
However, equality is still an uphill battle for the American Indian. Reservations are impoverished, with a lack of information about how and where to vote, and discrimination in everything from healthcare to everyday interactions. There's a lot of progress to be made in the fight for liberty, but the Navajo Code Talkers are a symbol of hope and pride for the indigenous everywhere.
The Navajo Code Talkers are more than just soldiers. They stand for ambition and steadfast pride in heritage. Even past their lifetimes, their legacy continues to drive the new generation of natives through their determination for freedom. The Navajo Code Talkers symbolize a huge reform of representation by Native Americans in the United States.